The sun was rising slowly over the small village of Willow Creek, deep in Tennessee, when Margaret Thompson opened the curtains of her whitewashed wooden house. Mist covered the countryside like a delicate veil, and the distant sound of church bells reminded her of times when everything seemed simpler. There was something in the air that morning, something she sensed but couldn't explain. A gentle foreboding, almost a whisper. Margaret had always been an observant woman. Even with her silver hair and the years etched into her hands, her eyes still held that curious gleam of someone who believes life always has something new to reveal. But in recent days, something had been nagging at her heart. She noticed little things, a light on at night in the abandoned warehouse, the sound of footsteps as everyone slept. And when she tried to tell someone, no one believed her. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, thank you. Now, take a deep breath, because what I'm about to tell you about Margaret will touch your heart. That morning, she walked to the corner market with her straw basket. The path was the same as always, but something was different. The old clock in the square had been showing the same time for days, and the sound of the stream seemed louder. Margaret mentioned it to the market owner, but received only a polite smile and a pitying look. "Oh dear, perhaps you're just tired," they said. But Margaret knew it wasn't weariness. It was a calling. A wake-up call God had placed in her heart. Returning home, she saw the neighbor's old dog barking into space, staring at the shed across the field. The same shed where, years ago, a mysterious event had changed the course of the town. Since then, no one had come near it. She stood still for a few seconds, watching. The wind rustled the leaves of the ancient oak, and the sound of the cicadas seemed louder than usual. Something inside her told her to go into that shed, but also to wait. And Margaret knew how to hear her heart's voice, even when the world fell silent. "God, show me what you want me to see," she murmured softly. That night, the sky was clear, and the stars seemed to shine brighter. Margaret lit a candle, sat in the rocking chair, and opened her Bible. She read a verse that said, "The truth will set you free." Those words sent shivers down her spine. Something inside her told her the truth was much closer than she imagined, perhaps within herself. In the days that followed, she began to observe more closely. Every sound, every shadow, every person who crossed her path. The mailman, who always smiled, seemed in a hurry. The woman at the bakery, who used to be kind, now avoided looking her in the eye. It was as if everyone knew something she didn't yet know. Margaret began to doubt herself. Was he losing his mind? People whispered as she passed. Some said loneliness made the mind play tricks. But deep down, Margaret knew it wasn't her imagination. It was as if the past was trying to speak again, begging to be heard. One afternoon, while watering the flowers in the garden, she heard that sound again, a whisper coming from the shed. Faint, distant but real. She dropped the watering can and lay still, her heart pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to be speaking her name. With trembling hands, Margaret approached the gate. Rust crackled as she pushed against the rusty padlock. For a moment, she felt fear. But there was something greater than fear, a sense of purpose. As if God were guiding her toward something that needed to happen. As she entered the shed, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The afternoon light filtered through the cracks in the boards, creating golden beams. In the corner, a chest covered in an old cloth caught her eye. Margaret walked over to it, knelt, and slowly pulled back the cloth. There was something inside that time had tried to hide. She touched the padlock, and it opened with a simple push, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside the trunk were yellowed papers, old photographs, and a small wooden box. Opening it, Margaret found a carefully folded letter addressed to her. The handwriting was familiar. Very familiar. His heart stopped for a moment. It was the handwriting of Jonathan, the man she loved when she was young, and whom everyone believed had died over 50 years ago. She put her hand to her mouth in disbelief. The letter began, "If you are reading this, it is because the truth has finally found its way back." Tears welled up before she even finished reading. Jonathan spoke of a secret he'd never had the courage to reveal, something that involved his own town and a broken promise. Margaret felt a deep chill. Everything she'd felt so far was beginning to make sense. The whisper. It was a call from the past. She looked around, and for the first time in a long time, she felt fear of what she might discover. But she also felt strength. The same strength that had sustained her when she lost her husband, when she raised her children alone, when she survived the loneliness of winters. "Lord, if it is your will for me to discover this, guide me," she prayed silently. Over the next few days, Margaret returned to the shed several times, always alone. She read and reread the letters, trying to piece together the puzzle of the past. There were names she recognized, people who still lived in the city, people who, perhaps, had something to hide. And with each reading, the truth seemed to come a little closer. But not everyone was happy with her interest. One morning, there was a loud knock on her door. When she opened it, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside, a short note, "Leave the past where it is." Margaret froze. Who would send this? Why now? The fear returned, but something inside her told her to keep going. She knew that truth doesn't come without resistance. And the more she prayed, the more she felt she was on the right path. Margaret didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. She just wanted to understand why, after so many years, the past was calling her back. One night, the kitchen radio turned on by itself. The voice coming from it was talking about the unsolved case of Silverstone Lake. The same lake where Jonathan had disappeared decades earlier. Margaret sat up slowly, her hands on her chest. Her name had been mentioned on the program. And in that instant she knew, none of this was a coincidence. Memories began to flood back like an old movie. Their youth, the summer dance, the farewell on the pier, the whispered promises under the moon. Jonathan had promised to return. But he never did. Or perhaps he had never truly left. What no one knew was that the truth was much closer than anyone imagined. Margaret lay awake all night, rereading the letters, watching the candle flicker beside the open Bible. "The truth will set you free." The phrase seemed to take on new meaning. She understood that her mission was not just to remember, but to reveal. And perhaps, to restore something that had been broken long ago. In the following days, rumors began to spread. Someone claimed to have seen her walking through the fields at night. Others swore they heard her voice singing ancient hymns near the lake. Margaret became the talk of the town, again. But this time, she didn't care. Fear gave way to determination. She had a mission. And it was at this point that the unexpected happened. Margaret found a photograph lying near the gate. It was old, but clear. In it, Jonathan stood next to a man she had never seen before. On the back was a date, April 24th, 1953. And a handwritten sentence, "What began at the lake must end there." That sentence became a sentence in her heart. Margaret knew she had to return to Silverstone Lake, the place where it all began and where it all ended. But what she didn't yet know is that this return would change not only her life, but the fate of the entire town. And so, on a cold, still morning, Margaret put on her blue coat, grabbed her Bible, and set off for the lake. Unaware that she was about to discover something that would leave everyone, absolutely everyone, speechless. The drive to Silverstone Lake seemed longer than Margaret remembered. Every bend in the road stirred an old memory, as if time were folding before her. The trees seemed to whisper forgotten secrets, and the scent of pine brought back lost youth. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with recognition. It was like returning home after a lifetime. As she walked, she remembered the last time she had been in this place. Jonathan wore a blue shirt and carried a small box in his hands. "One day, this will all make sense," he had said before disappearing into the water. Margaret had never understood what that meant. Until now. The letters, the photo, the date, everything pointed to that moment. As she reached the lakeshore, she felt a deep chill. The wind blew hard, and the surface of the water seemed to mirror the gray sky. Margaret knelt and said a brief prayer. "Lord, if it be your will, reveal to me what I need to see." The echo of her voice mingled with the sound of the gentle waves. And then something strange happened. A piece of wood floated near the shore. It was ancient, with rust marks and what appeared to be hand engraving. Margaret carefully pulled the object out and realized it was part of a boat, perhaps the same one Jonathan used. And there, carved into the wood, was her name. Margaret. The tears came without warning. She touched the name as if touching an old wound. The memory of Jonathan smiling, promising to return, burned inside her like fire and tenderness at the same time. But along with the memory came something else, a strange sensation, almost a certainty. Someone was watching. Margaret looked around, but saw no one. Only the old, abandoned pier and the distant echo of a raven. Even so, her heart sank. It was as if Jonathan's presence still lingered there, amidst the shadows and the waves. And for the first time, she wondered, had he really died on that lake? That night, back home, Margaret opened the letters again. There was one I hadn't yet read in its entirety. In it, Jonathan mentioned a hidden document, something he'd kept in a safe place near the lake. And it ended with a sentence that sounded like a farewell. If I don't return, it's because the truth is too big to tell. Margaret's mind raced. She remembered the story she'd heard as a young girl, about a mysterious deal involving the mayor, the town bank, and a plot of land near the lake. At the time, it all seemed like hearsay. But what if Jonathan had discovered something he shouldn't have? What if that secret had cost him his life? Over the next few days, she tried to talk to some of the older people in the community. Most avoided the subject. "Those things are in the past, dear," they said. But there was one man who didn't look away, old Samuel, the church's former caretaker. When Margaret mentioned Jonathan's name, he was silent for a long time. Then he whispered, "Not everything that seems lost is truly lost." Those words echoed in her mind. What had Samuel meant by that? Margaret decided to return to the lake, alone, at night. The full moon illuminated the path, and the sound of the wind through the trees seemed to beckon her. In the middle of the field, she saw something shining beneath the earth, near a moss-covered rock. She knelt and began digging with her hands. The earth was damp, cold, and soon her fingers touched something metal. It was a small, rusty box, bearing the same symbol Jonathan used in his notebooks, a cross enclosed in a circle. She carried it home, her heart racing, her hands trembling. Something inside her told her that her life would never be the same after that night. Back in the kitchen, Margaret cleaned the box and tried to open it. But the lock wouldn't budge. After a few failed attempts, she grabbed an old butter knife and pried open the lid. The sound of metal breaking echoed through the silent house. And when she finally opened it, she froze. Inside was a small photograph and a name. The photo showed a group of men in front of a building, the old city bank. Among them was Jonathan. And beside him, the mayor at the time, Mr. Harris, the current mayor's father. Behind the photo, a single sentence, "It all started with the loan." Margaret felt her world spin. Jonathan had never died by accident. He had discovered something that could not be revealed. From that moment on, fear turned into purpose. Margaret decided that, no matter what, she would discover what Jonathan was trying to reveal. And with each prayer she said, she felt greater peace, as if God were confirming that she was on the right path. The truth sets you free, but first, it shakes everything around you, she thought silently. The next day, Margaret went to the public library. She searched through old newspapers, town hall minutes, and property records. And then she found what she was looking for. In 1953, the bank had approved a large loan for the construction of a community center that was never built. The money disappeared, and the case was quietly shelved. Jonathan was an accountant at the bank at the time. He probably discovered the embezzlement and tried to report it. But before he could, he disappeared. Margaret felt her palms sweat. The truth was revealing itself, layer by layer, like an old wound finally healing. But she still had no idea of the scale of the storm she was about to face. As she walked home, she felt the sensation of being followed again. Slow, careful steps. She turned quickly, but saw no one. Only the sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Still, her instincts told her someone was watching her every move. That night, someone left a wilted flower on her porch. A white rose, tied with a blue ribbon, the same color as the box she'd found. Margaret understood the message. Someone knew what she'd discovered. And they didn't want her to go on. But Margaret was no longer the same frightened woman she'd been before. She'd faced loss, loneliness, and now she was ready to face the truth. "If God brought me here, it's for a purpose," she said aloud, looking up at the sky. The wind blew stronger, as if responding to her courage. The next day, she went to church and found Pastor Michael, a kind young man. He told her everything he had learned. He listened attentively and said something that resonated with her. "Margaret, sometimes God chooses those no one hears to reveal what everyone needs to know." Her throat tightened and she wept. For the first time, someone believed her. Encouraged by this renewed faith, Margaret decided it was time to act. She began writing down everything she knew in a notebook: the dates, the names, the letters, the photos. "If anything happens to me, let it speak for me," she wrote on the cover. It was the first time in decades that she felt she was fulfilling a greater mission. But that very night, the unexpected happened. The notebook disappeared. She had left it on the living room table, and in the morning it was gone. No open windows, no forced doors. Just silence. Margaret searched everywhere, but it was useless. Someone had broken in. The fear returned, more intense than ever. But with it came a strange calm. Because if someone was trying to hide the truth, it was because it truly existed. And if it did, it needed to be revealed. Margaret closed her eyes and prayed, "Lord, give me the courage to carry on, even when the world doesn't believe." And so, with a heart full of faith and trembling hands, Margaret turned her attention to the lake. She sensed there was still something there, something Jonathan wanted her to find. One last clue. One last secret. The past insisted on coming back, and she knew the next answer would come from the waters. Dawn arrived heavily, with thick clouds covering the sky and the air smelling of rain. Margaret rose early, unable to sleep. The sound of the waves on Silverstone Lake echoed within her, like an ancient song. This was where it all began. And now she felt something, or someone, calling her back to that same place. She made a strong coffee, put on her blue coat, and pocketed Jonathan's photograph. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a different woman. Not the lonely old woman everyone assumed, but someone on a mission. "Lord, guide my steps," she whispered before leaving. The cold wind slapped her face as a reminder that this would be no ordinary day. The path to the lake was deserted. The ground was damp, and the leaves stuck to her boots crunched with every step. Margaret stopped before the old sign that read, "City Property, Restricted Access." She hesitated. For a moment, she considered turning back. But something stronger pushed her forward. She knew the truth lay beyond that fence. The sound of the water was almost hypnotic. Margaret approached slowly, her heart racing. Then she saw something different, a small, ancient boat, half hidden by branches. She had never been there before. She bent down, brushed the moss from the side, and felt the same chill she had felt the day she found the letters. Engraved in the wood was the name Jonathan. Tears came without asking for permission. The boat was real. Jonathan had been there, perhaps even in the last moments of his life. Margaret looked out into the deep, dark water, and a distant memory struck her like a lightning bolt, the sound of a scream, the glow of a flashlight, and the silence that followed. It was the night he disappeared. And now she remembered it all. At the time, no one believed her. They said it was just an accident, that Jonathan had drunk too much, that the boat capsized, and the body was never found. But Margaret knew there was more. She remembered a male voice arguing with Jonathan near the pier. A voice that, now, seemed very familiar. And worst of all, it was someone who still lived in town. Margaret knelt near the shore and touched the water. Cold, dark, but calm. "Show me, Lord, show me what I need to see." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a bubble appeared, followed by another, as if something were moving below. Fear made her recoil. And then she saw it, a metallic glint beneath the shallow water near the rocks. She took off her shoes and stepped into the water, feeling the chill creep up her legs. The wind was blowing stronger now, and the sky was beginning to close in. Margaret dipped her hands in and pulled out the object. It was a silver chain with a cross-shaped pendant. The same one Jonathan always wore. The chain was intact, as if time had waited for it. Margaret fell to her knees in the water, crying. He was here. He was here all along. That was when she heard the snap of a twig behind her. She turned quickly, but saw no one. Only the sound of the wind. Even so, she knew she wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She put away her chain and hurried out of the water. The sky poured down with rain. She ran to her car, but before getting in, she noticed something strange. On the fogged-up window, a phrase was scrawled with her finger. "Stop searching." Her blood ran cold. She looked around, but the field was empty. Margaret got in the car and sped off, praying she would make it home. Back in the safety of her room, she lit a candle and placed the chain on the table. The symbol of the cross glowed in the flame, a reminder that God was still with her. "They can try to silence me, but they won't erase the truth," she said quietly. And in that moment, she decided she would go through with it, no matter what. The next morning, Margaret went to the local sheriff, a middle-aged man named Tom Bailey. She told him everything: the letters, the photos, the boat, the chain. He listened quietly, without interrupting. But when she finished, he just shook his head and said, "Margaret, these old stories lead nowhere. Don't reopen wounds that have already healed." Her throat tightened. The same look of disbelief that had wounded her so many times appeared again. "These aren't old wounds, Sheriff. These are lies that still sting." He sighed, looked away, and promised to take a look. But Margaret knew he wouldn't do anything. And deep down, she suspected he also knew more than he was letting on. As she left the police station, she noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street. A man wearing a hat was watching from afar, his expression unmistakable. When she met his gaze, he started the engine and disappeared. That image remained etched in her mind. The same type of truck she remembered seeing the night she disappeared. Back home, Margaret began writing everything down in detail, every memory, every name, every clue. She needed to record it before they tried to erase her from history. As she wrote, thunder shook the windows. The storm had returned. And with it, an uncontrollable feeling that something was about to happen. During the night, the sound of loud knocking on the door woke her. 3 sharp knocks. She got up slowly, her heart racing. When she opened the door, no one was there. Just a wet envelope on the floor. Inside, a single photograph, herself, kneeling in the lake, holding the chain. Taken just hours earlier. Margaret dropped the envelope. Someone was watching her every step. Fear consumed her for a moment. But soon it transformed into strength. She knew that if she gave up now, Jonathan would have died in vain. She went to the bookshelf, picked up her Bible, and hugged it tightly. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The words wrapped around her like a cloak. The next morning, she went to Pastor Michael again. She showed him the photo. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Margaret, if the enemy is fighting back, it's because you're close to the truth." That lit a flame within her. Faith became her armor. And with every step, she felt God guiding her through shadows and secrets. Determined, she returned to the lake for the 3rd time. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky orange and gold. Margaret sat on the dock and watched the light reflect off the water. It was strange, but there was something beautiful about this place, even with all the sad memories. She took a deep breath and, for the first time, felt peace. Jonathan wasn't far away. He was there, somehow. Then the impossible happened. A metallic sound echoed beneath the pier. Margaret stood and peered between the planks. Something glistened below, trapped between the stones. She knelt and reached inside. It was a small, watertight box, covered in slime. Her heart nearly stopped. On the lid were the initials, J.T., Jonathan Thompson. Trembling, she opened the box. Inside was a roll of old film, a key, and a sealed letter. The paper was damp but legible. "If anything happens to me, give this to the man of faith. He will know what to do." Margaret felt her legs weaken. The man of faith. Was it Pastor Michael? Jonathan had trusted him, or someone who had held the same position decades ago. Margaret ran back to the car, the box in her arms. The rain was falling again, and the rumble of thunder seemed to follow every curve in the road. When she got home, she locked the doors and turned on the lights. She placed the box on the table and stared at the letter. The handwriting was his. Every stroke, every curve, like an embrace that spanned time. She took a deep breath and opened it. The first few lines left her breathless. Jonathan described a discovery made inside the bank, implicating not only the mayor but also church leaders and local businesspeople. A network of corruption that used God's name to cover up crimes. And Jonathan, driven by faith, had tried to expose it all. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. The entire city had been built on a lie. And now, she was the only one who knew everything. For a moment, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But soon, faith spoke louder. God chose me because He knows I can endure. Outside, thunder lit the window, and a shadow crossed the lawn. Margaret was no longer alone. Dawn arrived silently, as if the world held its breath along with Margaret. She had stayed awake all night, reading and rereading Jonathan's letter. Each word burned in her soul like fire and hope at the same time. What else had he hidden? And why had he chosen her to uncover it all, so many years later? Margaret stared at the box on the table, the sunlight catching the rusted metal. She knew there was more, something she couldn't see. She got up, went to her bedroom, and opened the old wooden trunk where she kept mementos from her youth. Photos, dried flowers, a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. And there, beneath a pile of old fabrics, something strange caught her eye. It was a yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax. The symbol, the same one on the letter found in the lake. Her hands trembled. She broke the seal slowly, smelling the ancient paper. Inside were several letters dated 1953, all signed by Jonathan. But the contents seemed impossible. The letters spoke of a secret agreement between city leaders and outside investors, using church land as collateral. Jonathan had discovered that some of the missing bank money had been anonymously donated to the congregation itself, meaning that people of faith were implicated in the corruption. "They use God's name in vain," he wrote. "And if I disappear, it's because the truth has scared them." Margaret felt her legs give out. She sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. The world she knew was crumbling. People she had always respected, leaders who preached honesty and forgiveness, were at the center of the sin Jonathan had tried to expose. And worst of all, some of them were still alive, holding positions of power. She stood up, determined. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She walked to the church with the letters hidden in her purse. Pastor Michael greeted her with a concerned smile. "Margaret, you look tired." She placed the letters on the table and replied, "The truth is tiring too, Pastor. But it needs to be told." His smile faded. He read silently for a few minutes. Then he looked up, visibly shaken. "This is serious, but we must be careful. If all this is true, many people will want to keep these words from seeing the light of day." Margaret nodded. "That's what they did to Jonathan." The room fell silent, heavy with memory and faith. The pastor took a deep breath. "Leave these letters with me. I'll know what to do." For a moment, Margaret considered accepting them. But something in her heart, a soft, firm voice, told her not to. She gathered up the letters, smiled gently, and replied, "God asked me to keep them. It's not time yet." And she walked out of the church with firm steps. On the way back, the wind blew hard. Dark clouds covered the sun, and the smell of rain mingled with the damp earth. Margaret felt the weight of her mission, but also a strange peace. God was with her. Even alone, she knew she was not fighting alone. Jonathan's whisper seemed to accompany her, "The truth will set you free." At home, she opened the trunk again. Among the letters, she found a photo she'd never seen before. It was of a group of smiling young people, among them Jonathan and Pastor Michael's father. On the back, a handwritten message, "It all started with faith." Her heart sank. Could the secret span generations? Margaret took a deep breath and walked over to the living room radio. It tuned to a local station and, coincidentally, heard a report about old investigations being reopened. The bank's name was mentioned. The whole town seemed about to revisit the past. But who would be responsible for bringing it all to light? Was someone else following the same leads? Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the mailman, with a package addressed to her, no return address. Margaret signed and closed the door. The package was light, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was an old notebook with a worn leather cover. On the first page, a sentence that made her freeze. Continue what I started. The following pages were filled with detailed notes, amounts, names, dates. Jonathan had documented everything. It was concrete proof that he had uncovered the corruption and that he had tried to bring it to justice. But the most striking thing was the end, a list of people involved, and among them, a name she hadn't expected to see. Pastor Michael. Margaret felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. It couldn't be. The man who had welcomed her, who had prayed with her, who had encouraged her to have faith, was he part of the same scheme? Or was Jonathan referring to his father? The dates blurred everything. The lines between past and present began to blur, as if history were repeating itself. She closed the notebook and fell to her knees. Tears came hard. Lord, show me the truth, even if it hurts. I need to see it with your eyes, not my own. Silence answered for a few seconds, and then a beam of light shot through the window, illuminating the letters on the floor. Margaret felt something inside her, a certainty. It was time to reveal. But before she could act, she heard footsteps outside. Steady, hurried footsteps. Someone was prowling around her house again. She turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains. The same black pickup truck was parked across the street. Margaret backed away, her heart pounding. This time, she knew it wasn't a coincidence. They were close. Very close. Clutching the notebook to her chest, she hid behind the chair. The doorknob turned slowly. A click. Then silence. For long minutes, she didn't move. Then she heard a man's voice outside, deep, familiar. Hand over what isn't yours, Margaret. This isn't your problem. The sound of the words made her freeze. She knew that voice. It was Sheriff Bailey. Margaret choked back tears. Her hands trembled, but her heart was firm. She wouldn't give anything away. If Jonathan died for this, I'll live for it, she whispered to herself. After a few minutes, the sound of the truck's engine faded away. Silence returned, but the tension remained. The war between fear and faith had just begun. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase. She put the letters, the notebook, and the silver chain inside. She knew she couldn't stay home. She needed to protect what she had. She went to the old home of Jonathan's brother, who lived far away on a farm on the outskirts of town. A man named Henry Thompson, now nearly 80 years old. When Margaret arrived, Henry was shocked. "My God, you're Margaret." She nodded, thrilled. He invited her in, and as he heard her story, his hands began to tremble. "Jonathan trusted you. He told me, before he disappeared, that only one person would have the courage to finish what he started." Henry then revealed something that would change everything. From the bottom of a drawer, he pulled out an antique key. "This is the key to the safe deposit box Jonathan left at the bank. He said that if anything happened, the truth would be hidden inside." Margaret held the key reverently, as if touching something sacred. That small piece of metal was the final link in a broken story. But before she could ask any questions, a gunshot echoed outside. The window shattered, and Henry fell to the ground, wounded. Margaret screamed for help, but no one answered. Fear gripped her, and she crouched down, holding his hand. "Henry, please hold on," he whispered shakily. "Don't trust anyone in the church," and closed his eyes. Margaret wept silently, her heart breaking. But through her tears, she felt something different, a kind of strength that didn't come from her. She grabbed the key and stood up. "God, if this is your will, I won't stop now." The blood on her hands mixed with her tears, but her eyes were steady. She knew what she had to do. Outside, the truck disappeared down the dirt road. The rain began to fall again, washing away the ground and the fear. Margaret pocketed the key, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "Lord, if Jonathan trusted me, I trust you." And she left. She didn't know it yet, but her next stop, the town's old bank, held the secret that would change everything forever. The day dawned heavy, and the city seemed different. Margaret felt the stares everywhere she went. At the market, at church, even at the post office, whispers followed her like shadows. "She's gone mad," some said. "She's making up stories to get attention," others murmured. But she knew what she carried was real, and too dangerous to ignore. The safe deposit box key rested in her pocket, like a heart beating outside her body. Every step she took seemed to echo through the narrow streets of Willow Creek. Margaret knew the bank had been closed for years, but the foundation still belonged to the town. She needed to get inside. She needed to open the safe Jonathan had left behind, and discover what he'd risked his life to hide. First, however, she decided to stop by the church. Pastor Michael greeted her with a confused expression. "Margaret, I hear you've been asking dangerous questions." She remained calm. "Pastor, the truth is never dangerous. What is dangerous is silence." His gaze shifted for a moment, and in that brief silence she realized something. He knew more than he was saying. As she left, she noticed a murmur growing among the faithful. Hard stares, whispers. No one saw her as the sweet, gentle woman anymore. Now, she was a threat. The woman who stirred wounds everyone wanted to forget. Even so, Margaret lifted her chin. "God is with me. And that is enough," she murmured to herself, her heart firm. That afternoon, she went to the abandoned bank. The building was old, covered in ivy, with broken windows and a faded sign. He pushed the wooden door, which groaned as it opened. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air. Every step I took made the floor creak. But Margaret didn't back down. I was about to uncover a part of history no one wanted to see. She found the safe at the back of the main room, behind a cracked wall. The lock was old, but the key fit perfectly. A metallic click echoed, and the heavy door swung open. Inside were several folders, a sealed envelope, and an old Bible with the name Jonathan Thompson engraved in gold. Margaret swallowed. This was more than I expected. She opened the envelope and found a complete dossier, bank documents, transfer records, and handwritten notes. The signatures were unmistakable: the then-mayor, the previous sheriff, and Pastor Michael's father. Jonathan had hoarded enough evidence to expose all the town's corruption. But why had it all remained hidden for so long? As she leafed through the papers, a noise from the entryway made her stop. Footsteps. Slowly, Margaret turned, and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. The hat, the dark coat. Sheriff Bailey. "I warned you, Margaret. Some truths are best left buried." He took a step forward, and fear froze her legs. But she didn't move. "Jonathan trusted me," she said firmly. "And you're going to have to kill me to stop me from telling him." The sheriff sighed, approaching slowly. "You don't understand, old woman. This will destroy everything. Families, reputations, the town itself." Margaret held up Jonathan's Bible. "Then destroy it. Because a town built on lies is already in ruins." For a moment, the man hesitated. His eyes wavered. And Margaret realized something. He, too, carried guilt. Maybe he hadn't participated, but he knew. He knew, and he kept quiet. "You can arrest me, you can threaten me, but you can't erase what's already been revealed," she said, her voice trembling. The sheriff remained silent. Then he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Margaret took a deep breath. The solitude of the room felt alive. She gathered the documents and placed them inside the Bible. "Lord, give me courage. Because I know what comes next will be even harder." The distant sound of sirens echoed down the street. She knew the city would begin to turn against her, a woman alone, facing an entire system. In the following days, the persecution began subtly. People stopped greeting her. The baker refused to sell her bread. Her once friendly neighbor closed her curtains as she passed. And at church, the pastor avoided her. Margaret's name became synonymous with shame. But inside her, a flame remained burning. Faith was her only companion. One night, she received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was hoarse, urgent. "They're going to try to take evidence from you. Go to the old shed. There's something there you need to see." Margaret recognized the tone. It was old Samuel, the church caretaker. She hadn't seen him in weeks. "Samuel, what's going on?" But the call ended before he could answer. She hurried out, carrying the Bible and documents with her. The road to the warehouse was shrouded in fog. The wind blew hard, and every tree seemed to whisper her name. When she arrived, the door was ajar. The smell of smoke made her hesitate. She entered slowly and saw Samuel lying unconscious on the ground, holding an envelope. Margaret ran to him. "Samuel, talk to me." He struggled to open his eyes and murmured, "They know. Everyone knows. But the truth will prevail." Then he fainted. Margaret opened the envelope and found a letter addressed to her. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means they've come for me. Inside this envelope is something that proves everything. Trust no one." Inside was an old photograph of a group of men, the same ones from the other letters, and in the corner of the image, the symbol of a cross surrounded by a circle. Only this time, there was an inscription around it, "Order of Silence." Margaret felt her stomach turn. The corruption wasn't just political. It was spiritual, and perhaps older than I imagined. Suddenly, the sound of tires outside. Headlights illuminated the warehouse windows. Margaret put the letter away and hid behind a cabinet. The door banged open. Male voices filled the space. "Search everything." Within seconds, the warehouse was filled with flashlights. Margaret held her breath, her heart pounding like a drum. One of the men passed so close she could hear his watch ticking. But miraculously, he didn't see her. When they finally left, Margaret fell to her knees. "Thank you, Lord, thank you." Tears of relief streamed down her face. But she knew she wasn't safe. The truth now had a price, and she was paying with her own peace. She returned home before dawn. She was exhausted, covered in dust and fear. But there was a strange serenity in her heart. As she lit a candle and opened Jonathan's Bible, a piece of paper fell out. An underlined verse, "There is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known." It was as if he were still speaking to her. Margaret knelt and prayed silently. "Lord, if this is my cross, I will carry it." In that moment, she felt something like an invisible embrace, a comforting presence. Her faith, once shaken, was now unshakable. Even if the whole world doubted her, she knew God believed in her. The next morning, the local newspaper carried the headline, "Elderly Woman Spreads Rumors About the City's Past. Police Investigate." Margaret looked at her photo on the cover and smiled tenderly. "You can mock me, you can judge me. But truth is patient." The world's judgment was loud, but God's was silent, and far more just. As she sipped her coffee, she heard a knock on the door. It was Pastor Michael, his expression grave. "Margaret, we need to talk." She invited him in. He sat down hesitantly. "People are afraid. What you're doing could destroy everything we've built." Margaret replied calmly, "Then maybe it wasn't built on the right rock." The pastor lowered his head, took a deep breath, and blurted out, "My father was part of it, and so was I." Time stood still. The words echoed through the room like thunder. Margaret stood still, unsure whether to cry or give thanks. Finally, someone had admitted it. The truth was beginning to break the silence, and with it, redemption. Michael began to cry. "I didn't know what my father did. But when I found out, I tried to hide it to protect the church. And now, it's all coming back." Margaret held his hands and said tenderly, "The truth doesn't destroy, Pastor. It heals. But first, it exposes." He nodded, his eyes welling up. For the first time, two broken hearts were united by the same faith. And it was then that Margaret understood, true judgment wasn't what the city made of her, it was what each person made of their own conscience. God's justice comes not with applause, but with repentance. And in that moment, she knew the worst was over. The silence was about to be broken forever. Outside, the church bell rang in the distance, like a harbinger. Margaret looked out the window and saw the sky opening after days of storms. But she knew, the calm was just a breather before the next revelation. Because Jonathan's voice had not yet said its last word. The morning began like any other, with the aroma of fresh coffee and the distant sound of church bells. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam rise from her mug. The newspaper still carried her picture, its cruel headlines, but now she no longer cared. Something inside her had changed. Faith had become stronger than shame. As she considered what to do with the evidence, the old radio in the kitchen turned on by itself. The sound crackled, as if searching for a lost station. Margaret approached slowly, adjusting the dial. Then, a male voice echoed, "Today, we're reopening a case that marked Willow Creek's history, the disappearance of Jonathan Thompson." She froze. Her heart raced. His name, spoken aloud, after decades of silence. Margaret sat up slowly, her eyes never leaving the radio. The voice continued, "New information indicates that Jonathan's death may not have been accidental. Rumor has it that documents were recently found linking his name to a secret investigation into local corruption." She clapped her hand over her mouth, overcome with emotion. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone, perhaps Pastor Michael himself, had decided to act. But who was the speaker? The voice was calm, steady, with a familiar tone. What's more, anonymous sources claim that a woman in the community may be in possession of the original evidence. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. His name was not mentioned, but everyone knew who he was. Within minutes, the entire city would hear. The story they had tried to erase now echoed on every radio. Margaret was torn between fear and gratitude. "Lord, if it is your will for the truth to come out, then let it be." The program continued, and the revelations grew even deeper. The announcer read excerpts from Jonathan's letters, words Margaret knew by heart. "The truth sets you free, even when it hurts," one of them read. She recognized every line, every comma. Jonathan spoke as if he were alive, as if this were the day he could finally be heard. Margaret wept silently, murmuring a prayer of thanks. But not everyone reacted with joy. Within minutes, the house phone began ringing non-stop. Voices were raised, some fearful, others angry. "What have you done, Margaret?" a woman shouted. "Why don't you let bygones be bygones?" Another said, "We're with you. Don't stop now." It was as if the entire town had awakened from a long slumber. Margaret hung up the phone and knelt beside the radio. "Thank you, Lord, thank you." For the first time, she didn't feel alone. The announcer's voice returned. "Some say divine justice works slowly but surely. And perhaps Willow Creek's time has finally come." Those words sounded like a prophecy. Hours later, the radio went silent again. But the impact had already been made. Margaret looked out the window and saw neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, talking quietly. Some of their gazes were hostile, others filled with compassion. She knew the city was divided, between those who feared the truth and those who yearned for it. The wind blew gently, like a sign from God. Late that afternoon, Pastor Michael appeared at her door again. His expression was tired but determined. "I was the one who sent the information to the radio," he confessed. "I think Jonathan wanted this. And, Margaret, there's more." He pulled a cassette recording from his pocket. "It's his voice." Margaret gasped. Jonathan had left a recording. They inserted the tape into the living room's antique recorder. A hissing sound, followed by Jonathan's unmistakable voice. "If you're hearing this, it's because the truth has finally found its way. I fear nothing, for I trust in God. Lies may prosper for a time, but the Lord's justice endures forever." Margaret brought her hands to her face, sobbing. It was like hearing a ghost, but a ghost of faith, not fear. Jonathan continued, "True love is not the kind that remains silent in the face of error, but the kind that faces it with compassion. Margaret, if you ever hear my voice, know that I loved you to the end." The tears flowed like silent rivers. It was him. It was truly him. The pastor bowed his head, moved. "He knew you would be the chosen one, Margaret." She nodded, still crying. "He didn't make a mistake." The tape ended with a prayer. "Lord, hold in your hands those who dare to seek the truth, even when the world won't listen." The silence that followed was sacred, as if heaven itself were listening. In the following days, the news spread. The radio repeated the story, newspapers began investigating, and Jonathan's name was once again mentioned with respect. But along with the attention came danger. Margaret began noticing unfamiliar cars circling her house. Sheriff Bailey disappeared from town, without warning, and rumors swirled that important documents had gone missing from City Hall. Despite this, hope blossomed. Young people from the church began visiting her, asking to hear her side of the story. Some called her the voice of courage. Margaret smiled humbly. "It wasn't me. It was God. I just obeyed." With every word, She made it clear that faith, not revenge, was what sustained her journey. But one night, as she listened to the radio again, something changed. The same announcer's voice announced, "We've received a new, anonymous audio message that promises to reveal the true culprit in Jonathan Thompson's death." Margaret froze. The tape began to play, and a different voice, cold and arrogant, filled the air. "I did what I had to do. He knew too much." Margaret felt her blood run cold. She recognized that voice. It was Sheriff Bailey, the man who had threatened her so many times. The silence that followed on the radio was piercing. Then the announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the confession Willow Creek has waited over 50 years for." Tears streamed down Margaret's face, of pain, but also of relief. The next day, the city looked different. People knocked on his door, asking forgiveness for doubting. The church was packed like never before. Pastor Michael preached about redemption and truth, quoting the verse Jonathan loved, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Margaret, sitting in the back pew, wept silently. Divine justice had begun. But not all was resolved. That night, a new letter was left on her porch. The paper was damp with dew, and the handwriting was different, elegant, ancient. "The truth you heard is only half. The rest is in the waters." Margaret read and reread it, uncomprehending. In the waters? What else could be hidden in Silverstone Lake? Fear and curiosity mingled. Had Jonathan spoken in code? Or was someone playing a trick on her? Margaret prayed silently. "Lord, if there is still more to be revealed, give me strength." The wind blew gently, extinguishing the candle on the table. And in that instant, she knew, the lake still held secrets. The next day, Margaret returned to the dock. The sun reflected off the calm waters, but her heart was pounding. What else could the past hide? She looked at her reflection and felt a presence beside her, as if Jonathan were there, watching. The radio, the love, the faith, everything seemed aligned in a single purpose. Redemption was near. She knelt at the edge of the pier and let the silver chain fall into the water. Whatever is true, let it come to light. The waves lapped at the pendant, and a golden glow flickered for a moment before fading. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. Something told her the story wasn't over yet, it had just changed tone. Because sometimes the voice of truth does not speak through the lips, but through the heart. And Margaret's heart still had much to say. The wind picked up at dusk, blowing hard from the north, bringing the smell of rain and wet earth. Margaret watched the sky darken, the clouds piling up like mountains of gray cotton. There was something different about that night. The air was electric, pulsating, as if the sky itself was waiting for something. The radio hissed in the living room, but she no longer heard the words, only the call. Ever since the mysterious letter, her heart had been restless. In the waters. That phrase echoed repeatedly in her mind. The lake, always the lake. Margaret knew the ultimate secret was there. She grabbed her flashlight, her Bible, and the blue coat she had worn so often. "Lord, if this is the night, then may your will be done." And she left, even with the storm brewing on the horizon. The streets were deserted. The rain began to fall thinly, coldly, and sharply. With each step, the sound of thunder mingled with her memories. Jonathan smiling, Jonathan writing, Jonathan disappearing beneath the water. It was as if time were folding, bringing the past back into the present. Margaret knew something, or someone, was waiting for her at the lake. When she arrived, the wind was howling through the trees. Rough waters lapped against the pier, and lightning lit the sky in silver flashes. Margaret took a deep breath. "Show me, Lord." She walked to the end of the pier, where Jonathan's old boat still sat moored, rocking violently. Each creak of wood sounded like a whisper from the depths. She knelt and touched the water. Cold. Alive. "What else am I supposed to see?" he murmured. Then something reflected beneath the pier, a metallic glint, like a mirror hidden deep within. Without a second thought, Margaret kicked off her shoes and descended the stairs to the edge. The rain intensified, thunder ripped through the sky, but none of that stopped her. Love and faith spoke louder than fear. She sank waist-deep, feeling the weight of water and age on her body. The reflection was stronger now, as if the lightning was calling to it. Margaret bent down, reached out, and touched the object. It was a small, sealed metal box. On the lid were the initials J.T. and the same symbol, the cross within the circle. Her heart raced. This was real. Suddenly, a voice echoed behind her, "I warned you not to come back here, Margaret." She turned slowly. Sheriff Bailey stood there, in the rain, shining a flashlight in her direction. His face was tense, his eyes cold. "You destroyed everything. Everything I tried to protect." Margaret remained calm. "No, Sheriff. I only revealed what you hid." "You don't understand," he shouted, the wind nearly swallowing his words. "If this truth comes out, it will destroy us all. Me. My family. The whole town." Margaret held up the box, trembling. "Then let it be over. Because the lie has already killed too many." Thunder boomed in the sky, and lightning illuminated them both as if God himself were witnessing the scene. Bailey took a menacing step forward. "Give it to me now." Margaret backed away, the water rising to her waist. "No," he took another step forward. "Don't make me do this." She looked him in the eye, firmly. "What are you going to do, Sheriff? Kill me, too?" The silence that followed was broken only by the storm. Then, a gunshot. The dry sound echoed through the valley. Margaret staggered, but the shot had missed her. The next flash showed Pastor Michael standing behind the sheriff, his hands trembling, holding a gun. "Bailey, it's over." The sheriff turned in surprise. "Michael, you," the pastor shouted back, tears in his eyes. "You lied, you killed, and you used God's name to justify your sin. It's over, in the name of the Lord." Bailey ran toward the pastor, and the two struggled in the rain, slipping in the mud. Margaret knelt, clutching the box to her chest. Thunder and lightning illuminated the chaos, the fury of men against divine power. A second shot. Then silence. When Margaret looked up, Bailey was on the ground. The pastor was trembling, his gun lying in the mud. She ran to him. "Are you okay?" Michael nodded, crying. "He tried to kill me." Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. "God's justice doesn't need weapons, Pastor. It works alone." The distant sound of sirens began to echo. The rain washed away the blood and guilt. Michael fell to his knees and prayed, "Lord, forgive us. Deliver us from the darkness." Margaret stood, still holding the box. The water was now waist-deep. The waves crashed hard, as if trying to rip the object from her hands. But she didn't let go. "Jonathan, I did it," she whispered through her tears. Another bolt of lightning illuminated the lake, and in that brief flash she saw the reflection of two faces, side by side. Hers and Jonathan's, smiling. Startled, she blinked. The reflection was gone, but the warmth in her chest remained. It was like an invisible embrace, a confirmation that he was there. Margaret walked back to the dock, exhausted but at peace. The pastor helped her up. The box was intact, gleaming in the rain like a sacred reliquary. "It's all here," she said. "Everything he kept." When police arrived, they found Bailey collapsed and Margaret sitting on the dock, holding the Bible and the box. An officer asked, "Did you do this?" She simply replied, "The truth did." The pastor confirmed everything. And that night, to the sound of the storm, the lies of half a century were finally exposed. The next day, the newspapers talked about nothing else. The truth hidden in the waters. Thompson case reopens old wounds. The entire town watched in shock. Margaret, however, sought neither fame nor glory. She remained silent, gazing out the window at the lake. The thunder had ceased, and dawn brought the soft sound of birds. Peace at last. But something inside her still pulsed. A premonition. She opened the box again. Inside were papers, photographs, a ring, and a letter. In Jonathan's handwriting. "My beloved Margaret, if this letter ever reaches you, it means the storm has passed. But remember, truth is eternal, and so is love." The tears came again, hot, pure. Margaret held the letter to her chest and smiled. "I heard you, Jonathan. And everyone else heard you too." Through the window, a rainbow appeared over the lake, a symbol of promise and forgiveness. Evil had been defeated, but the price of truth would always leave its mark. Even so, she knew, God had transformed pain into liberation. That evening, Margaret returned to the pier, now silent. The moon reflected on the calm waters, as if the lake were finally sleeping peacefully. She tossed white petals onto the surface and prayed, "Lord, thank you for allowing me to see what so many have tried to hide. May these waters now be of healing, not guilt." A gentle wind blew, extinguishing the candles around her. Suddenly, she heard a soft sound, like footsteps on wood. She turned, but no one was there. Still, she felt his presence. Jonathan. "I kept my promise," she whispered. The moonlight reflected off the water, forming the outline of a cross. Margaret smiled tenderly. The truth had finally found its way. But as she walked away, something caught her eye. Near the shore, a small vial floated, an ancient one, with a piece of paper inside. She picked it up, opened it slowly, and read the message, "There is still more. Forgiveness completes what truth began." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the breeze touch her face. The storm was over. But the dawn still held one last miracle. The morning after the storm dawned golden and calm. The sky seemed cleansed, pure, as if God himself had passed his hand over the city to erase the past. Willow Creek was silent. No cars, no murmur. Only the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant song of birds. A sacred silence, as if everyone was afraid to speak first. Margaret woke early, the memory of the previous night still etched in her eyes. The smell of rain still lingered, and Jonathan's Bible remained open on the table where he'd left it. The verse he read, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt light. News spread quickly. The newspapers spoke of "covered corruption," secrets revealed, and "the woman who defied half a century of silence." But Margaret refused to give interviews. She turned away every reporter who knocked on her door. She wasn't seeking recognition, she just wanted peace. The kind of peace that comes when the soul finally fulfills its purpose. The town, on the other hand, seemed stunned. Some wept, others begged for forgiveness, and many still tried to deny it. The church, previously filled with murmurs and vanity, now stood with its doors open, silent, with worshippers kneeling in prayer. Pastor Michael preached daily about repentance and starting over. "The truth heals, but first it purifies," he said with a choked voice. Margaret listened to him on the radio while sipping tea on the porch. His every word felt like healing. She knew God was doing what he always does, turning ruin into redemption. The city that had judged her was now beginning to understand. And though many still avoided her on the streets, others approached her with grateful looks. "You were the voice we never had," they said. But deep down, Margaret knew none of this had been human. "It was him," she repeated to herself. "It was always him." The letters, the storm, the radio, even the pastor's forgiveness, it all followed a greater plan. The kind of plan that only time and faith can reveal. And now, she felt the time of harvest had arrived. In the following days, the confessions began. Men and women who had kept secrets came forward. Some publicly apologized, others left anonymous letters at the church. The truth had opened a wound, yes, but it was also cleansing the collective soul of Willow Creek. It was as if the entire town was undergoing an invisible baptism. Margaret walked the streets with calm steps, and people watched her in silence. No one mocked anymore. No one whispered anymore. Now, silence was respect. Children ran, bells rang again, and the old square, once forgotten, flourished again. Life began to sprout from the ashes of shame. One afternoon, she passed the old bank. The building was surrounded, about to be demolished. Margaret paused for a moment, observing the broken windows and ivy-covered walls. Everything built on lies must crumble sooner or later, she thought. The wind blew, and a piece of the sign fell to the ground. It was the end of a cycle. Back home, she sat at the table and wrote a letter. Not to the press, nor to the pastor, but to God. "Thank you, Lord, for not letting me give up when no one believed in me. Thank you for turning pain into a mission. And thank you for showing me that truth is not a weapon, but a bridge." She folded the paper and placed it inside her Bible. The next day, Pastor Michael sought her out again. His eyes were tired, but with a new glow, the glow of humility. "Margaret, the church wants to hold a service in your honor." She smiled serenely. "No, Pastor. Hold a service in honor of the truth. It was she who saved the city, not me." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. The service took place on Sunday. The church was packed. People of all ages came, some from neighboring towns. There were flowers, songs, and tears. When Margaret entered, everyone stood. Not in applause, but in reverence. The pastor stepped to the pulpit and said, "Today, we celebrate not a person, but the power of God to transform the impossible into a miracle." And the congregation responded with a soft amen. Margaret sat in the last pew, her hands on Jonathan's Bible. Every word spoken that morning seemed to echo off the temple walls and into the heart of the city. Faith had been reborn. But she knew that true faith doesn't need crowds, only silence. A silence that speaks louder than 1,000 voices. After the service, many people came to embrace her. Young people who had never met her, elderly people who had judged her and now asked for forgiveness. Margaret embraced them tenderly. "Forgiveness is the second truth," she said sweetly. "And it begins when we stop aiming and start loving." Her words, simple and full of wisdom, became the new gospel of the city. As the weeks passed, routine returned. But nothing was the same. The streets seemed livelier, the air lighter. Lies had lost ground, and love was gaining ground. Margaret spent her days tending the garden and writing short notes in a notebook. She called it, "The Things God Told Me." One morning, a young reporter approached her. "Mrs. Thompson, may I record your story?" Margaret smiled. "My daughter, my story is already recorded where it matters, in the hearts of those who believed too late." The young woman insisted, "But people need to hear it." Margaret looked to the sky and replied, "Then tell it, but say that the credit goes to God. I was only the echo." The reporter was moved. "You changed this city." Margaret laughed softly. "No, dear. I just reminded people that the truth still exists." And with that smile, she said goodbye. Deep down, she knew her role was fulfilled. But she also knew that life, like faith, never ends, it just changes form. That same night, she returned to the lake. The moon's reflection shone serenely on the surface. Margaret sat on the pier and closed her eyes. "All is peaceful now, Jonathan." The wind blew gently, and the sound of the water seemed to respond. She believed that true love never fades, it only changes its home. And that lake was now a sanctuary, not a tomb. Suddenly, she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Pastor Michael. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. "The city is different, Margaret. Quiet, but alive." She nodded. Silence is the first sound of healing. They stood there, side by side, watching the moon's reflection on the water. No words were necessary. The pastor looked at her gratefully. "What are you going to do now?" She smiled, looking out at the horizon. "Listen. Because when the world is silent, God speaks louder." Michael closed his eyes and said a short prayer. And for the first time in a long time, the city's silence wasn't fear, it was peace. Days later, Margaret received a letter with no return address. Inside was just an old photo of her and Jonathan, smiling by the lake. On the back, a sentence, "Until the end, I believed in you." She held the photo to her chest and wept, not in sadness, but in gratitude. The love that had sustained her now set her free. As dusk fell, the town lights came on one by one, and the sound of bells echoed again. Willow Creek was at peace. The past slept, the truth remained, and forgiveness flourished. Margaret watched from the porch, her heart at peace. She knew God had written a new chapter for this place, and for her soul as well. But as the wind blew, bringing the distant sound of the radio, she heard something curious. A new voice said, "Stories like Margaret Thompson's remind us that faith never grows old." She smiled, moved. The truth now resonated, and that echo would span generations. The silence of the city had finally become the sound of redemption. The dawn of that Sunday brought a different light. The sun rose slowly, gilding the treetops and making the dew sparkle like diamonds on the grass. Margaret opened the windows and let the cool breeze in. She took a deep breath, feeling her soul light, almost new. It was as if each ray of sunlight said, "You have won, my daughter." The silence that had once been heavy now felt comforting. She sat at the table with her Bible open and a steaming cup of tea. The pages moved with the wind until they stopped at Psalm 91. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Margaret smiled. Rest. That was what God was asking of her now. Rest, not oblivion. The city was slowly waking up. Children played in the street, the church bell rang softly, and the local radio announced a new era of transparency and faith. Pastor Michael spoke live, his voice serene. When a city is healed by truth, the dawn becomes the most beautiful miracle. Margaret listened, moved. That dawn was a gift. As the sun rose, she walked to the garden. The flowers seemed more vibrant, and the old oak tree cast cool shade over the lawn. Margaret knelt before the flower bed Jonathan had planted decades ago. "Look, my love, they've bloomed again." The wind blew through the petals, like a kiss from the past. And for the first time, she felt complete peace. In the days that followed, the town continued to transform. People helped each other more, neighbors greeted each other kindly, and prayers once again filled the mornings. Willow Creek, once marked by shame, now became a symbol of hope. It was the miracle of a new beginning, and everyone knew it had begun with a woman who never gave up on her faith. Margaret began receiving letters from all over the country. People who had heard her story on the radio thanked her for her courage. Widows, mothers, young people, pastors, all saying the same thing: "Your faith has rekindled ours." She read each one with tears in her eyes. "It wasn't me," she replied quietly. "It was God. It's always been Him." But something inside her was also renewed. Old age, once heavy, now seemed light. Her tired body still ached, but her spirit danced. She laughed more, prayed more, and even sang the old hymns of her youth. Her house filled with visitors, people who came seeking advice, prayers, or just a hug. And Margaret welcomed them with the same love she had always offered Jonathan. One morning, Pastor Michael came to visit her with an envelope in his hand. "I brought you something," he said. It was an official document from the city, declaring that Silverstone Lake would be renamed Lake of Truth, in honor of her and Jonathan. Margaret smiled, moved. "You didn't need this," she replied. "But it's beautiful to see God transforming waters of pain into waters of life." The following week, the town gathered for the ceremony. Hundreds of people lined the lakeshore, children holding white flowers, the church choir singing "Amazing Grace." The sun's reflection on the water formed an arc of light. Margaret stood there, wearing her blue coat and holding a Bible. The pastor called her to the microphone. "Margaret, the town would like to hear your words." She took a deep breath, the wind rustling her silver hair. "I don't have much to say," she began softly. "Only that God is faithful. Even when the world doubts, He continues to work, in silence, in waiting, and even in pain. The truth sets us free, but forgiveness heals. And today, I choose forgiveness." Soft applause filled the air. But what was heard most was the sound of the water, serene, divine. After the event, Margaret stood alone on the dock, gazing at the reflection of the sky. She touched the water with her fingertips and closed her eyes. "Thank you, Lord, for not giving up on me when I wanted to give up on everything." At that moment, she felt something warm in her chest, a light, a presence. And she heard, ever so softly, the voice she knew so well, "You are not alone, Margaret." She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, she saw Jonathan's reflection beside her, smiling. No words were spoken, but everything was understood. It was love. It was faith. It was eternity in the form of memory. When she blinked again, the reflection was gone, but the sense of peace remained. God had permitted the encounter that time could not prevent. In the following days, Margaret began writing a book. She called it "The Light That Came from the Waters." It wasn't about pain, nor scandal, but about redemption. Each chapter was a prayer disguised as a story, a conversation between her and God. She wrote slowly, calmly, like someone sowing words in fertile soil. "Maybe someone will need this one day," she would say with a smile. Every sunset, she would sit on the porch and read a passage aloud. The neighborhood children would come over, sit at her feet, and listen, spellbound. Margaret would tell them not only about Jonathan, but also about faith, forgiveness, and courage. "Truth doesn't age," she would say. "It just waits for the right moment to blossom." One afternoon, while reading to the children, one of them asked, "Mrs. Thompson, do you still hear the lake speak?" Margaret smiled. "Yes, sometimes. It speaks not with words, but with peace. When you feel peace in your heart, it is God speaking softly." The children fell silent, amazed, and their laughter mingled with the sound of the wind seemed like heavenly music. Margaret's health began to fail over time. Her body could no longer keep up with her spirit. But she didn't complain. She said every ache was just a reminder that she was one step closer to heaven. Pastor Michael visited her every week, bringing flowers from the lake and stories from the town. "Everyone misses you at Mass," she would say. She smiled. "I'm here praying for everyone." On one of these visits, the pastor brought a radio tape. "I thought you might like to hear it." It was a recording of the broadcast that had told her story to the nation. Margaret listened, tears in her eyes. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "If this story brought anyone back to God, then it was worth every tear." Michael replied, "It brought many, Margaret, including me." That night, she lay awake watching the sky. The stars seemed closer, and the wind blew like a soft song. She picked up her Bible and read Jonathan's words for the last time, "Truth is the first step to a miracle." He smiled, closed the book, and whispered, "Then let the miracle come, Lord." And the next dawn, he came. The neighbors found Margaret sitting on the porch, a serene smile on her face, the Bible on her lap. The sun was shining on her face, and the flowers in the garden bowed slightly, as if in reverence. The radio played "Amazing Grace" softly. It was a different kind of dawn, the kind that only happens when heaven touches earth. The news spread throughout the town, and everyone gathered at the lake for a final tribute. The waters were calm, golden with the light of the rising sun. Pastor Michael spoke briefly. "Margaret Thompson taught us that faith is the greatest miracle of all, because it transforms death into dawn." And at that moment, the sky opened in shades of gold and pink. A white bird flew over the lake, landing on the pier. Silence. Only the sound of the water and the beating of wings. Willow Creek dawned in peace, and Margaret's heart was finally at home. Months had passed since the dawn of Margaret's departure. But in Willow Creek, her presence was still felt on every street, every flower in the garden, every sunset over the lake. The White House where she lived became a symbol of hope. People left flowers on the porch and notes with thanks and prayers. It was as if the whole town breathed faith again. News of her passing spread across the country. Radio programs, newspapers, and churches began telling her story. The woman who defied silence. The elderly woman who revived faith. The truth of Willow Creek. Each title was a tribute to something greater than herself, to the divine power that works through willing hearts. Margaret's former home was transformed into a small community center. Children came there to learn about faith, honesty, and courage. Pastor Michael led weekly meetings, where he read excerpts from the book she had left behind, The Light That Came from the Waters. And whenever he finished a reading, he would say, "Margaret believed that God speaks to those who do not give up listening." In the garden, a bronze plaque read, "Here lived a woman who believed when no one else did." Each dawn, the sun reflected off the letters, making them glow. Many said it was a sign of blessing. Others believed it was simply nature. But for those who knew Margaret, there was no doubt, it was God smiling upon Willow Creek. The Lake of Truth had become a pilgrimage site. People came from other cities to see the place where faith rose up against fear. Some left flowers in the water, others prayed silently. Many wept. The silence that once held secrets now held solace. Each drop seemed to sing a song of forgiveness and new beginnings. Pastor Michael, now older, continued preaching with the same fervor. He said it all began with an unheard voice. Margaret was living proof that God chooses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. Her words touched hearts. And with each sermon, new believers joined the church, not out of tradition, but out of transformation. Younger generations grew up hearing the story. In schools, teachers told stories about the woman who wouldn't keep quiet. "When you're afraid to tell the truth, remember Mrs. Thompson," one teacher would say. Children would look at her portrait on the wall and smile. To them, Margaret was more than a legend. She was a role model. Years later, a Christian writer decided to publish the full story of Willow Creek. The book, based on Margaret's letters and diaries, became a nationwide success. The Woman Who Spoke to Water inspired thousands of people to rekindle their faith. And many claimed to feel something different after reading it, a gentle presence, as if Margaret herself were still guiding them. Pastor Michael received an autographed copy from the author and placed it on the church altar. "This book is a seed," he said during the service. "May it blossom in every heart willing to forgive." That day, the church was filled with tears and gratitude. It was as if Margaret's spirit was there, smiling among the pews. Time passed, but the story never faded. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, the town held a ceremony by the lake. They called it the Night of Truth. The lights were dimmed, and each resident lit a candle and placed it in the water. Hundreds of flames floated, reflecting in the water like stars descending from the sky. During the ceremony, the pastor read a quote from Margaret: "Truth sets free. Forgiveness heals. And love saves." And each time he read it, the wind blew gently, swaying the sails, as if the Holy Spirit himself were passing through them. It was impossible not to be moved. Willow Creek had become more than a town, it had become a testimony. On the local radio station, the same one that had once broadcast her story, the announcer now dedicated the first show of each morning to her. "Good morning, Willow Creek," he said softly. "Today, remember to listen more, judge less, and always believe." It became tradition. Faith had become part of the routine. It was the invisible legacy Margaret had left. One day, a group of young people visited her home. Amid laughter and curiosity, they found something no one knew existed, an envelope hidden behind an old portrait. Inside, a letter in her careful handwriting. "If you are reading this, it is because the truth still lives. Take care of it, teach it, and never forget that love is the voice of God." The words spread through the city like a new breath of life. The letter was read on the radio, printed in newspapers, and framed at the entrance to the community center. Take care of the truth. 3 simple yet eternal words. It was as if Margaret had left a reminder for every soul who passed by. Faith needs to be cared for every day. Her legacy inspired a new social project, the Margaret Thompson Program, dedicated to helping older women who felt forgotten. The motto was, "It's never too late to be God's voice." And, interestingly, many of the volunteers reported feeling a calm and encouraging presence during their work. "As if she were still here," they said with a smile. Over time, even the name Willow Creek began to be associated with faith and renewal. Pilgrims came from far and wide, not for tourism, but for spiritual seeking. They wanted to touch the waters, hear the stories, feel the silence that spoke. Tourism became devotion. And what had once been shame was now a living testimony of grace. Years later, a Christian filmmaker produced a film inspired by Margaret. The title, When Truth Called Your Name. The film moved millions of viewers and carried messages of faith across the country. At the end of the film, as the lake appeared at sunset, a narration said, "Some whispers are from God, and only those who listen with their hearts can understand." The impact was so profound that churches, schools, and even hospitals began using Margaret's name for their projects: the House of Truth, Thompson Hospital, Willow Creek Foundation. Each new name was a seed of remembrance. And so, she became immortal, not in monuments, but in acts of kindness spread across the country. Pastor Michael, now very elderly, used to visit the lake every Sunday. He would sit on the same pier and read her words aloud: "Listen, believe, forgive." And with each reading, the wind blew, the water shimmered, and he felt Margaret still there. "You have fulfilled your mission, my friend," he would say with a trembling voice. "Now it is our turn." When he left years later, the town gathered again. And on his tombstone, beside the lake, they engraved his most frequently repeated words: "Truth does not die. It just changes its voice." Thus 2 souls were joined forever, the pastor's and Margaret's, eternal guardians of the Willow Creek faith. Today, decades later, visitors still say the lake holds a gentle sound at dawn. A whisper carried by the wind over the waters, like a song. No one can explain it, but many believe it's Margaret's voice, reminding them, God speaks in the silence. And those who stop to listen feel peace take over their souls. The world has changed, but her story lives on. It's told in sermons, in songs, in books, and in hearts. Because Margaret Thompson wasn't just a woman, she was a message. A living reminder that faith can move mountains, and truth, when revealed with love, heals even the oldest wounds. And so, the town that once doubted itself learned to doubt, to trust again, to love again. Willow Creek became a beacon of faith in a country that so often forgets to listen. And whenever the sun rises over the lake of truth, it's as if the sky itself says, love has won. But perhaps, the most beautiful thing of all is knowing that the story doesn't end here. Because every time someone chooses truth over fear, Margaret is reborn, silent, serene, eternal. There are stories that end, and there are stories that continue within us. A of Margaret Thompson's one of those. Because when one woman chooses to believe in God, even when no one else believes in her, the whole world changes. Maybe not all at once, but one soul at a time. And maybe that's what heaven calls a miracle. Margaret was no heroine. She was an ordinary woman, with silver hair and tired hands, who only decided to listen to the whisper of faith when everyone was laughing. She had no power, no influence, but she had something no one could take away, the courage to remain true to the truth. And that's what turned her into an eternal flame, illuminating lives she would never know. You know, maybe the truth is whispering in your life too. Maybe there are things that time has made you forget, but your heart insists on remembering. Wounds that still need healing, people who still need your forgiveness. And maybe God is telling you right now, it's not too late to start over. Margaret's faith showed that God does not choose the strong, He strengthens the chosen. And when everything seems lost, that's when He begins to write the most beautiful chapters. Because pain is just the prelude to miracles. And every sincere tear is a prayer that heaven understands, even in silence. Think about it. Have you ever experienced a time when no one believed in you? Have you ever felt like giving up, but something, or someone, whispered to keep going? What if that whisper is God calling you to live your own story of faith? Today, perhaps your lake is not made of water. It could be a fear, a loss, a past that still hurts. But remember, the same light that shone upon the waters of Willow Creek still shines upon you. And if you decide to believe, even if the world doubts, the miracle will begin. Before I finish, I want to do something Margaret always did. Close your eyes for a moment and listen with your heart. Lord, bless those who are listening now. Fill this life with light, health, joy, and above all, faith. May each dawn bring peace, and may the love of your Son be a shelter throughout each day. Amen. And if this story touched your heart, I ask you with affection, like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This helps me continue to spread messages of faith and hope, stories that remind me that God's love never gets old. And now I ask you, have you ever felt something similar to Margaret? What would you do if you were called to defend the truth, even alone? Leave your comment. I would love to read what God has done or is doing in your life. Remember, faith is the language that heaven understands, and truth is the voice through which God speaks. And whoever hears that voice will never be the same again.